Welcome everyone this evening. Thank you for coming to the Mid-Hudson Valley Visitor Center, Peter Beanstalk and his family. My name is David Conn. I'm your host this evening. Tonight we're proud to present Taylor Bruck, who is the Deputy Ulster County Clerk. He's also the historian of the city of Kingston. He's also the captain of the Kingston Guards vintage baseball team. But the character of George Von Beck is a very interesting one, and let's have an idea of what's going on with him right now.
Thanks, Dave. And thanks to the whole board of the D&H Canal Museum for inviting me. This is going to be a fascinating talk. When Bill asked me to talk about something related to the canal, Von Beck had always been in the back of my mind as someone that was interesting. But as we started doing research, we realized it was far more interesting than I originally thought. We call him the alleged lunatic because, as you'll see, there was a court case where he was alleged to be a lunatic. And so I won't spoil anything. We'll just dive right in, and then we can judge for ourselves whether or not he was a lunatic. But we'll start with a quick outline. We're going to talk about his early life. He was a German immigrant. So where did he come from? Why did he come here? Why did he come or end up in Rondout specifically? His family life is really where the story starts taking multiple turns and branching out into a fascinating history. And then the lawsuit itself, this lunacy case, and how the lunacy case turned out. So we'll start with George Von Beck here. He was born in Germany on May 13th, 1798, and he had a fairly well-off family. His father was working for the Ordnance Department under Napoleon. His father actually died about 20 years after Von Beck was born, fleeing Moscow. And his family was actually French, but they lived in Germany. And they fled to Germany during the French Revolution in 1795. And his first sort of big break was with the Alsace-Lorraine border. So he went to school in Germany for mathematics and engineering. And after the Second Treaty of Paris, had nothing to do with the Treaty of Paris with the Rev War that we know about. The Second Treaty of Paris was signed after the defeat of Napoleon, and they needed to redraw the border. And Von Beck was one of 6 people that was tasked to lay out the new border. He had to survey it with these other 5 folks, and he got a lot of experience in surveying and doing trigonometry, mathematics regarding land. And this all comes from a New York Herald record in 1870 that I'll be referring to. The press didn't report on Von Beck too much until the lunacy case. But once the lunacy case happened, there were all of these stories about Von Beck and his life. So a lot of what we know about his life comes from these. This here is the King of Bavaria, Maximilian Joseph, who gifted Von Beck a gold medal for his work on the Alsace-Lorraine border and for his work with the militia. He was always part of the military, and he was great at rounding up troops if you needed more folks in your militia. Von Beck was your guy. He really could bring a crowd in, and he was good at what he did. There was a very strange fact that I learned about this king specifically. In 1801, there was a glassmaker's workshop in Germany that had collapsed, and he led the rescue effort to rescue people during the collapse. And one of the people that he rescued was a 14-year-old named Joseph von Fraunhofer. And after he rescued this 14-year-old, he gave the 14-year-old a bunch of books. And he said, "Joseph, study these books and you'll do great things." And Joseph von Fraunhofer ended up inventing the spectroscope. And he thanked this king for years afterwards for rescuing him. And this king gave Von Beck a gold medal. This king also was married twice and had sets of children under both wives. This is called foreshadowing. Remember that? And so after the Alsace-Lorraine border incident, or after the job was done, Von Beck had a job on the Rhone-Rhine Canal. And a lot of the experience that he had gained in the border was helpful here. Again, he was a mathematics student and an engineer, and this even looks like the D&H Canal if you look at pictures of it. So this canal was made to connect the Rhine with the North Sea. Von Beck actually fled to America before this was finished, so he worked on like the very early portions of this canal, and he called it the Imperial Canal, which confused the heck out of us in the archives. When we looked into the Imperial Canal, it didn't exist. There were like 7 different canals called the Imperial Canal. This is the only one that matches the date span that he was in Germany, and it was right on the border, really, of Germany and France. So it's right where he lived. So it's very likely that this was the Imperial Canal that he was referring to. So after he worked on this, he actually moved to Spain and joined the Spanish army, where he was gravely injured. And after he was injured, he moved to this small town, again, right on the border of Germany and France, Capsewer? Is that how you pronounce this? Any German speakers here?
Capsevere.
And he became the mayor. So he was a popular guy. So he was still wounded from war, he had a limp and whatnot, but he became the mayor here. And why would he leave? So shortly after this, he fled to New York, and this was the first big mystery. Like, he was a mayor, he got this gold medal, he was making great money. Why did he leave? His account of why he left is fascinating. He says that he joined the wrong side of a revolution. There were a lot of revolutions at this time. He joined the wrong side of a revolution that didn't really take off, didn't even really have a name. But he claims that his liberality of political sentiments basically made him an enemy in the eyes of the royal family there. He complained in writing that his workers weren't only taxed for their tea, but for their light and their air. And he went on and said, they're being taxed for everything, this is a mess. And he received a letter from a friend of his from the French Parliament that said, you need to leave tonight. You need to leave immediately. They're coming to get you. You have spoken out too much. And so he left his family. He had a wife. He had children. He left his German family behind. And the king seized all of his property. So virtually overnight, this wealthy mayor, gold medal recipient, has nothing. And he leaves. And he jumps on a boat and comes to New York in 1832. 1832 is an interesting year for immigration because it predates Ellis Island, predates Castle Garden. If you're doing any kind of genealogical research, if you start researching prior to Ellis Island or Castle Garden, it's very difficult to find naturalization papers or really anything. Ship manifests are the best. We were not able to find his ship manifest, unfortunately. But I'd like to talk a little about Castle Garden because it's really interesting. It was originally called Castle Clinton after DeWitt Clinton. It was built around 1808, but it didn't become an immigration hub until 1855. So prior to that, they literally just dropped off ships full of immigrants on the south end of the Battery in New York City, and they had to figure it out from there. And that's where Von Beck was. Fortunately for him, he spoke a number of different languages. He spoke English, and that certainly helped him. The Marquis de Lafayette visited Castle Garden in 1824. It was greeted by over 6,000 New Yorkers. So between 1855 and 1890, right before Ellis Island was constructed, there was over 7.5 million immigrants that came to New York, right on the south end of the Battery. There was also a really interesting canal-related event that happened here. It's actually related to the Erie Canal. But it's still fascinating, and DeWitt Clinton. So when the Erie Canal was finished being constructed, they had a big event planned where DeWitt Clinton was going to go on the first barge that left from Buffalo and went all the way to New York City. And DeWitt Clinton hopped on, and there was a cannon in Buffalo. And then there was another cannon within earshot a little farther, and so on, all the way to New York City. And so when he left, they shot the cannon off. All the cannons go off in succession all the way down the river to New York City. And there was a young boy at the Battery, at Castle Garden really, who heard the last shot and said, wow, we now know DeWitt Clinton is coming. And he thought, what if you could transport letters this way? What if you said one shot is A, 2 shots RB. The young boy was Samuel Morse, and he had the idea for Morse code from this. And then he actually ended up coming back when his telegraph was first invented. He went to Castle Garden and held the first event there and to show it off what he did. So it's just a fun canal. I went to the Erie Canal Museum over the summer and they told me that. So that was fun. This is also, Castle Garden is really, if you have Irish heritage, during the potato famine, a lot of the Irish ended up going to Castle Garden. You can actually find those records fairly easily. So George Von Beck struggled to find a job right off the bat. And he did what a shocking amount of people did at the time. He went to Brooklyn, he spent about $10 and he bought an organ. And then he went to a pet store and spent between $3 and $5 and bought a monkey. And then he spent 2 to 3 weeks to train the monkey. And he was an organ grinder on Long Island. And that's where he made his first little bit of money. He ended up meeting an Ulster County resident on Long Island, J.G. Hardenberg. And J.G. Hardenberg and him started chatting. And J.G. Hardenberg said, why don't you come up to my farm? I have a nice big farm in Ulster County. You can work on the farm. And this is how Von Beck ended up in Ulster County, is through J.G. Hardenberg. And J.G. Hardenberg eventually became a friend of his, and he lent him money to purchase a horse and a boat that he could use to ship coal up and down the canal. He said this seems like a good business venture. The canal had just opened. And so he comes to Ulster County. He probably took a steamboat. This is another fun thing I wanted to talk about. Has anyone, Bill especially, heard of the flyby technique that Donald Ringwald, the famous steamboat historian, talked about? It was a harrowing technique that I like to think Von Beck, being the character that he was, used to get to Rondout. But the steamboat, the flyby technique, you would have a steamboat that's going up the river, then you'd have another boat that's coming out of the creek, and they wouldn't stop. And they would just go side by side, and the passengers would throw their luggage over, and they would jump over. And the state legislature ended up outlawing it short in the early or later 1800s, but it was still legal at this time. So I like to imagine that Von Beck did the flyby to get to Rondout. And then another big break came. So Von Beck has his canal boat. He's going up and down the canal transporting coal. And one day he noticed there was a group of people that were standing on the side of the canal. They were looking at a big crack that was in the canal. And they were trying to figure out where the crack started. And Von Beck, having worked on canals before and being a mathematician and engineer, he pulled his boat over and he hopped out and he took some measurements and did some math. And he said, Mr. Lord, who was the chief surveyor at the time, he said, I think this is where your crack is. And they virtually hired him on the spot. They said, wow, this guy's good. Like, let's get him in. And so this is how Von Beck ends up working on the canal, just because he showed off his expertise one day going up and down the canal. He started in a lower paying job and worked his way all the way up to paymaster. So this is where he really built his wealth in America, was on the canal. There's another sub-story that I don't have time for, but he eventually is forced to retire because there were inaccuracies that were found in his books. But he was already wealthy at that point. He said, that's fine, I'll retire, sure. At this time, he also joined the New York State Militia. And again, he had a lot of experience in rounding up the troops. And he was so good at this that the governor of New York at the time, Horatio Seymour, awarded him a sword that used to belong to the Marquis de Lafayette. So he lost his gold medal from Germany, but he was awarded a sword shortly after. So you can tell he was a pretty civically minded and impressive individual. Now, I want to talk a little about what Rondout was like in the 1830s. So when Von Beck comes down to Rondout and he starts working, what's it like? The canal had just finished, and there are virtually a flood of people that start moving into Rondout because of all the jobs that are available. And not just jobs on the canal, but there are a number of industries that start opening eventually, like the brickyards, the cement plant, bluestone, everyone knows all of this. But there's also all the other ancillary businesses that those people who came need to use tailors and grocers and everything. So there's plenty of jobs available in Rondout. And eventually the Ulster and Delaware train opens, and there's all kinds of train jobs. It's actually why my Irish family came here, was to help build the train tracks and whatnot. But there's another interesting thing to keep in mind when thinking about the Rondout from the 1830s, and that's the police. There's no police. There's no town watch. It's virtually a lawless land. It's a really interesting place to live. There is, by 1850, twice the population of the village of Kingston. So again, there's crime. There's this wonderful story about the town board trying to start a town watch, and they give the inhabitants two options. They say, okay, we all understand that we need a town watch. We can either tax you all, and we can pay for a full-time town watch to be on duty at all times, or every adult man of a certain age can sign up for a shift, and we can have a volunteer town watch. So all the inhabitants say, well, we would like to not be taxed. We'll sign up for a shift. So they all sign up for their shifts. The first day, nobody shows up. The second day, nobody shows up. And they just never show up. And so they never get a town watch until really the merger between the villages of Rondout and Kingston in 1872. There was like very specific crime prevention services. There's a horse thief association, for instance, that does pass. They say we need the horse thief association. But for a real town watch, there's nothing for a long time. And since there was no police, there was also, I hesitate to call them gangs because they're not gangs like we know them today, but there's groups of people that say we're going to police the town ourselves. But those groups also had prejudices, specifically the bumblebees. If anyone has heard of the bumblebees were a group of mostly firefighters in the villages of Rondout and Kingston. And when the Irish started coming in big groups, they said, these Irish are too rowdy, and we need to start a group to prevent the Irish from fighting at our big events, the 4th of July and things like that. But as you can imagine, when the bumblebees show up, and all the Irish are like, the bumblebees are here. They started the fights. So there was every single event virtually that I've found, there was a big fight. There was a steamboat riot where people alleged that they were throwing chairs and things off the steamboat. So George Von Beck was living in a very interesting place at the time. There was also a wonderful story about counter-knavery. So since there were no, again, very little regulation in the trade of bluestones and things, there was something they did where the buyer would measure and the seller would count the slabs that the buyer measured, and each knowing that the other would count to his own advantage, and each satisfied that the fairness would result from their combined dishonesty. This is what Nathaniel Booth wrote in his diary. Nathaniel Booth, if you're interested in this era or this location, Nathaniel Booth was in the bluestone trade in Wilbur and kept a very colorful diary that the Senate House Museum has, and it's fascinating to read. He complains consistently about virtually everything. But basically, this is where Von Beck moved to, and then he ends up making enough money to build this building, and this is how I learned about Von Beck. This is the building on the Rondout where Savona's is. It's right across the street from the old visitor center, and everyone knows where this is. And so he built it. It was originally a hotel called the Mansion House. It's still standing today, obviously, thank goodness. Everything on the other side of the street was torn down during urban renewal. They fortunately did not touch this one. During urban renewal, they had a funny idea. I was telling Dave about this. This is what we were chatting about. So urban renewal, originally they said, okay, we're going to tear down all these buildings. They're a mess. No one's taking care of them. But they didn't know what they wanted to do after that. So they put out like RFPs. The city said, okay, developers, give us ideas. And one of the ideas that a developer had that actually made it quite far in the process was to turn the Rondout into like a a mini Bourbon Street in New Orleans. And a lot of that was because of like the balconies that were here, which is interesting because Von Beck's family was French originally, even though he came from Germany. And you can kind of see the French influence on the balconies. Thank goodness Ward's giving me a face like, I'm so glad they didn't do that. But they thought about it. And yeah, if you go down, I thought a lot about the hoolie as I was doing this. I was like, the bumblebees would hate the hoolie. That would be their worst nightmare. But this house is still standing. So let's get into a bit of the Von Beck genealogy. And this is where things start getting, you'll see. So when he was in Germany, as I said, he had a wife and he had children. And when he came to America, he had to leave them behind. But in America, he didn't tell anybody that he had a wife and children. So he found a new wife in Eddyville, and he had a new family. He had more children. Marie Ann Kuntz was his German wife, and Jane Maria Deming was his Eddyville wife. So he starts a new family. He has more children. And eventually he receives a letter that says, we're sorry to let you know that your wife in Germany has passed. And Von Beck says, okay, send for my children. Tell my children where I am. I'll take care of them. But when his children come, he doesn't want his American family to know that he has other children. So he hires them as servants and brings them into his house as servants. And they work in his house as servants for a few years, and they're not happy about it, granted. They did keep the secret. They didn't tell anyone that they're actually his kids, but, you know, they wrote extensively afterwards about how he has shifted all his affection to his American family, and we get nothing, and they don't like this. And then his German wife shows up on the Rondout one day. She is not dead. We don't know who sent this letter that said that she had died, but when his German wife comes back, Von Beck says, well, my whole family's here, and he basically throws his American family out, and he takes all of his German family back, and he moves in with his German wife, and he says, finally, like, the family I had to leave, it turns out she's not dead. And so the two groups of children do not like each other. This is sort of the precursor to the lunacy case. This is when things started getting really out of hand. And Von Beck was a bit alarmed when his children from Germany had first come back. He said, I really need to legitimize my American marriage. And there were rumors that he had been married in Germany, but nobody knew for sure if she died or not. So he petitioned the New York State legislature to legitimize his American marriage, which they shockingly did. I can't imagine how much influence this guy had. But this is from 1844. There is a state legislature resolution that's passed that said the marriage between George Von Beck and Maria Deming is legalized. So this was great for George Von Beck until his German wife showed up, and now he has two legal marriages in New York State. And this is another unthinkable thing. Also, he accidentally legalized Mormonism shortly. This was a huge controversy. All the papers started writing about how there is this gentleman, George Von Beck, that has two legal marriages. If you remember, Mormonism started in New York. So this is shortly after, like, Mormonism starts growing in popularity in New York, and they said, oh my gosh, we accidentally legalized Mormonism because of this. And it was a whole big controversy. His poor American wife soon pined away and died, were his words, from a broken heart because of all of this, the controversy, the German wife. And Von Beck never talked about accidentally legalizing Mormonism. He kept that out. But he did note that when his American wife died, his son, George Jr., was not available because he was at a Negro ball, which is interesting because Von Beck was an abolitionist. He signed abolition papers, but it sounds like Von Beck Jr. was also sort of an abolitionist. He at least was attending Negro balls at the time, so they were fairly progressive people. Maybe what he said about being too politically liberal for the royalty was correct. He also goes on to talk about how his son George Jr. also shot at him during an argument, and the ball narrowly grazed his head. And there's a lot of stories about the two children fighting against each other and fighting Von Beck, frankly. He's a heck of a character. And as all this Mormon stuff is going on, he has a stroke. And it leaves him partially paralyzed, but he says it hasn't affected his mind at all. And this is where the lunacy case really started, because his children on the American side say his stroke has really messed with his mind. He is not in the right frame of mind when he took us out of the estate. All we want is for him to split the estate equally between both sets of children. And the reason that he took us out of the will is because he's a lunatic. He's crazy. Look at the multiple marriages and the secret children, and now he had a stroke, and he's not in the right frame of mind to do this. So on July 30th, the New York Herald wrote an article about the lunacy case, and they said this: "Probably no lawsuit has ever occurred along the Hudson River which is fraught with so much interest. A man of great wealth and high distinction brought into this court by his own children and pronounced by them to be either a lunatic or a forgerer is a spectacle so rare as to attract universal attention." So they started reporting on this case extensively. They were like, this is great press. What's going to happen here? There were a number of local doctors. There's a Dr. Elting and Dr. Crispell who testified to the unsoundness of Von Beck. Apparently, they did some sort of analysis, and they said, yeah, no, he's not of sound mind. He might be a lunatic. Then there was a number of other doctors and friends of his. There's a Dr. Hasbrook, Canfield, Stephen Hyatt, William Turk. They all testify to his soundness of mind and his good business qualities. They say, no, he's fine. He's always been like this. He's always been eccentric, but he's not a lunatic. And so Von Beck plans to flee. Strangely, he writes a letter. Again, he's partially paralyzed. He can't go very far. But he says, he writes a letter to his attorney, Jansen Hasbrook, and he says, "Dear sir, when this letter reaches you, I shall likely be upon the high seas on my way to Europe." He says there's people in Europe that owe him money in order to settle with the Hamburg Company, where I expect to get about $100,000 or more in 1870 money. Big money. He says, "I've been driven away from home for the second time, the first through my own folly for speaking out against the royalty, and this time for having placed my confidence in people not worthy of it, his children. I expect to be back in July." So he does plan to come back. At the time, the commission for the court case says, "We need to interview you extensively." And Von Beck says, "I'm not well enough to meet at the courthouse." So they meet him at the Mansion House, and over a 4-day period, they interview him. And this is where they learn that he could actually speak Hebrew, German, Italian, French, and English still. So this is part of his proof that he's not a lunatic. He still knows all of these languages. But there's a number of really quirky things that happened during the questioning. There is some account of Von Beck being initiated into the Sons of Malta, which kept the jury and the commission in one continuous round of laughter for multiple minutes. We did look. Has anyone heard of the Sons of Malta? It's
Not Knights of Malta. Is it Knights of Malta?
It's similar. It's an Italian organization that is, they're philanthropic. They do a lot of good work, but they're also a little secretive. They're sort of like the Freemasons. They're like the Italian Freemasons, but they didn't go into detail about this account. I'd love to know more. He noted in his statements that he gave that he does sometimes holler. He yells quite often, but that's because of the pain from the stroke, and that he's not actually a lunatic, but his neighbors do hear him yelling every so often. And then the question, obviously, at the end we all have is, was he a lunatic? What happened? And this is the most shocking part of the whole story. We have no idea what happened. We have no clue. Nobody reported on what ended up happening in the case. There's no court case that has the finale. Who got Lafayette's sword? Like, who got George Von Beck's wealth? We don't know. What we do know is that George Von Beck was quite a character, but he was also very good at his job on the canal. He made a lot of money, and my big takeaway is that when you drive by downtown, you see a big building, you're like, that's an interesting building. The story that is behind so many of these old buildings that we have in Ulster County are fascinating. And digging into these stories is so much fun. Our Ulster County archivist, John Palmer, is here. If anyone is interested in doing research like this and digging into your house or a house that you always just thought was interesting, that you drive by all the time, we can certainly help you out. We love doing this work. And I'm sorry I don't have a conclusion to the story. There was no conclusion anywhere. And that is crazy. But what was that?
Who ended up owning the hotel? Maybe that's an indication. Do we know that?
Maybe. Well, the family ended up selling. Von Beck ended up dying. Like, by the time he died, the hotel was still in his name. And then, that's a good question. I don't remember who owned the hotel. It wasn't a Von Beck. I know that.
James McEntee owned it 2 different times.
Yeah.
That was afterwards, right?
No, one was before.
Yeah, one was before.
It was before. So there wasn't 2 mansion houses?
No, it was this mansion.
It was the same mansion house.
The same spot.
Yeah.
In the same spot.
Yeah.
Same building.
Same building. Interesting. See, this is why I love doing these. I told Dave too, anytime you give a talk to...
With 2 deeds.
Or maybe. He was accused of being a forgerer. But yeah, unfortunately, we don't know where his wealth went. We don't know which side of the family got it. So we will continue to dig in. Ward, do you know?
But no, I was wondering, but there was no obituary, there's no...
No.
Where was he buried?
He's buried in Montrepot Cemetery. Yes, he's buried in Montrepot Cemetery. But we couldn't find an obituary. We couldn't find a will, an estate, which is shocking. We have all the wills in the archives. And
how about the children? None of them, you could, there's no...
no. Well, there was no, we got a lot of this research from newspaper articles. We couldn't find an actual court case, which is pretty common. Like, we have a lot of court indexes, but to find the actual case is they're not organized well enough. That's why we hired John. John's going to organize them someday. No big deal. But a lot of them are just court summaries, so they don't have all the testimony and what happened at the end, unfortunately. But does anyone have any questions? More questions?
Sequel next year?
Sequel next year? Oh, absolutely. We'll keep digging in. This happens every time I get a talk. I'm like, Bill, we're going to give this talk about this, and then we start digging in. We're like, oh my gosh, it never ends. It literally doesn't end. There's no end that we found yet.
Yeah.
So stay tuned. Yeah.
From my work, I've learned to be very skeptical of newspaper accounts of this era.
Oh, yeah.
And to rely on them always makes me nervous. So I was wondering if you had any other data that supported what the newspaper was saying.
Yes, but I will say the newspaper articles are even more skeptical because the newspaper articles are just referring to what Von Beck himself said.
Right.
So, yeah, we don't know.
I assume there's no attribution, there's no byline, there's nothing where you can check on who wrote the article?
There is, but we know who wrote the article. Well, we know what paper it was from, at least.
Yeah, but I mean, like the stuff I've been looking at in the New York Times from 1890 has no bylines.
Yeah. So we know that he worked on the canal. We know that he owned the mansion house. We know that he had children. We have census records for that. Bill actually has the letters from when he worked on the canal. We have writings back and forth. The things that we don't have primary source documentation for are the story that he told about his early life in Europe. Like I don't know for sure if he received a gold medal from the king, but he said that he did.
But do you have him coming back to the States after he leaves for Europe?
He actually doesn't leave a second time. He just told his attorney he was going to. But as far as we know, he did not actually leave.
How did he get his wealth? I mean, working on the canal was not necessarily private equity.
My understanding was by the time that he moved his way up to paymaster paid fairly well. Is this true, Bill? I don't actually know.
Higher, you know, it's upper management, you know.
Yeah.
It's the guy you're trusting with all your money.
Yes. Yeah.
He must have had some real estate holdings. I mean, to get $100,000 is a huge amount.
Well, he said that he was owed $100,000 in Europe. So we know that when he was in, his account was that he had a lot of wealth in Europe, but he didn't bring it over here with him. But he must have brought something over here with him because he bought the organ and the monkey. So he had some money that he brought with him. But again, maybe. But yeah, we'll never know. Yeah.
Was in this time period, calling somebody a lunatic, I assume had no real scientific definition or clear definition. Was it a strategy that families or people used to remove people?
I don't know. I know that in our like our poorhouse records and things, like lunacy is an attribute that they give to people, but I don't imagine there was any scientific way to prove whether or not somebody was a lunatic. Yeah, I don't think so.
It was a very common way to get rid of spouses you didn't like.
Right.
Up until the early 20s.
Yeah, I think this is why there were doctors on both sides that basically talk to him, and then they would tell the jury and the judge, we think he's a lunatic, or we think he's not a lunatic. But what they used to determine that, I'm sure, was not very scientific. Yeah. Any other questions?
Taylor Bruck, everyone.
Thank you very much.